Hello and welcome to this evening's program. How is everyone? How many introverts are in the room? How about extroverts? Woo-hoo-hoo! Well, it's so nice to see everyone here. My name is Michael Frederick. I'm the Executive Director of the Thoreau Society, and it's my honor and privilege to serve as Executive Director. To have an event like this, of course, requires the work of a lot of people. And tonight we have Richard Pecoretto, who's doing the audio-visual for us and our Zoom audience. This evening's program is live streamed on Zoom and will be recorded. If you have questions, Zoom audience, please use the chat feature to send those questions along to us. The Thoreau Society has a staff, but we are also a volunteer organization, and we would never be able to do our publications, the Thoreau Society Bulletin. Brent Rinaldi is here with us this evening. He's the editor of the Thoreau Society Bulletin, and we also have a large editorial staff for that publication. We also published the Concord Saunter, and tonight the editor Kathleen Kelly is here in the audience. She also has an all-volunteer editorial staff, and both of the editors are volunteers. And we have a 15-person board of directors, all volunteer, and we have volunteers who help us out with our events throughout the year. So we're really, really fortunate to have so many people who care about the life, works, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau. So I want to welcome you, and we can get on with the proceedings for the Thoreau Prize. The Henry David Thoreau Prize for Excellence in Nature Writing has been granted annually since 2010. The Thoreau Society began administering the prize in 2020, but for the first decade, the prize was administered by its founder, Dr. Dale Peterson, who is with us this evening. Dale is the author or editor of 21 books on a variety of subjects, including anthropology, art, computers, natural history, and animals. Dale is with us here tonight, and we want to thank him for recognizing the crucial role that nature writers play in our society towards the planet's future. It will be mentioned more than once tonight, but I would also like to mention a little about the Thoreau Prize endowment that we've been fundraising for over the last 12, 13, 14, 15 months. And we are now at a point where, towards our $250,000 goal to fund the Thoreau Prize in perpetuity, we have $15,000 in unmatched money left to raise. And we're hoping we can get further to that goalpost this evening with your help. So you'll take a look at your Thoreau Prize brochures, and there's information and a return envelope in that packet. Next, I'd like to welcome John Cusick, Thoreau Society Vice President, to the podium.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you, Terry, for joining us on a really momentous occasion. On behalf of the Thoreau Society, I'm honored to remind all of us that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Mesquitequid people, a tribe descended from the first people who arrived at this dawn land following the retreat of the last glacier, a people living and learning among these lands and waters for over 10,000 years. When English settlers arrived, the Mesquitequid were members of the Massachusetts Federation of Villages and part of the broader Wampanoag community to the east and south. They had deep connections to the Pawtucket people to the north and the Nipmuc people to the south and west. They raised their families in a village at the junction of the Aspet, Sudbury, and Concord rivers, fished at the mill dam, raised corn, beans, and squash in the Great Field, and hunted deer and gathered huckleberries in the woods and meadows. They welcomed English settlers in 1636 and soon moved to Neshoba, a few miles west, where they adopted Christianity and formed a praying village. During Metacom's War in 1676, they sought to avoid conflict and took shelter in Concord village at the home of Samuel Hoare, now known as the Orchard House, where they were seized and confined to Deer Island with other praying Indians in what's been described as America's first concentration camp. Those who survived found refuge with relatives on the outskirts of English settlement, and descendants of the Neshoba continue to make their home in Massachusetts. Henry David Thoreau knew this history well, and he acknowledged the long tenure of Native people in New England many times in his writing. He memorialized the Musqueam leader Tohotawan, marveled at the stone relics he found with uncanny ease, and sought to teach his students, young and old, something of the Indian wisdom he felt his own people desperately needed. Yet while Thoreau spoke out powerfully against slavery, he was more silent about Native dispossession and genocide, and he never allied himself with Native communities. We are fortunate to honor Terry Tempest Williams this evening for many reasons, one of which is the example she gives of how to work with Native leaders and communities as we seek to heal and preserve the lands on which all of us depend. Tonight, as we recognize Ms. Williams for her extraordinary work, we also thank the Musqueam people for their long stewardship of this land. We look forward to opportunities to work with their descendants and relatives in helping Native communities thrive, and we hope to learn more from their example about how to live more justly on this earth. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Rochelle Johnson, President of the Thoreau Society.
Welcome. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. Wish I could see all of you on Zoom. Thanks, John, for those meaningful words. In just a few minutes, we'll turn our attention to honoring our distinguished guest, who will share her words with us and then take a few questions from our audience after her remarks. First, though, I'd like to offer some more words of thanks to people who made this event possible. Thanks to Tricon for housing us, to Corinne Smith and the rest of the shop staff at the shop at Walden Pond for arranging for Terry Tempest Williams to sign some books in advance of this event. Those will be for sale in the next room. She signed them in advance as a COVID precaution in these days when we need such things. I also want to thank Mike Frederick, our executive director. He organized this evening, but he organizes all things Thoreau Society all year long and deserves all of our gratitude. Thank you, Mike. Given the events of this week, I want to take a few moments to acknowledge the horrific tragedy that unfolded Thursday in Lewiston, Maine. Many of us have loved ones who reside there or close by. All of us are shaken, struck by yet another horrific tragedy, bringing the deaths and injury of so many people. I have no words for such heartbreak and horror, but I do want to say that our hearts are with those who suffered and are suffering still. And I want to ask you to join me, please, in a moment of silence as we hold them in our hearts and minds. Terry Tempest Williams once wrote, "What we share as human beings is so much more than what separates us. If we listen to the land, we will know what to do." Those words can help us heal. They might ground us, leading us back to ourselves and to all that connects us. The Henry David Thoreau Prize for excellence in nature writing is awarded each year to an author who embodies the spirit of Henry David Thoreau as a gifted writer, an insightful naturalist, and an ethical thinker. Terry Tempest Williams writes of specific landscapes, of birds and rocks, of rising waters and red rock deserts. She writes of far northern landscapes draped in mountains and snow. She writes of the clan of one-breasted women, of the solace of solitude, of the erotics of landscape. And she writes of Navajo land, of threatened wilderness, national parks, and the water-carved corridors of canyonlands. And she writes of the halls of Congress, of the potential poetry of patriotism and of democracy and of human rights. She writes of, quote, dwarf fireweed creating flames of fuchsia on the riverbank. She writes of Walden Pond. Ms. Williams has published more than 24 books. Her essays and articles have appeared in scores of magazines, journals, newspapers. She lectures worldwide and is widely known for her ability to weave her words into an intricate tapestry of personal experience, landscape, lament, and powerful pleas for political movement against climate catastrophe. She is featured in interviews, profiles, and documentary films. She has provided services for regional and national environmental nonprofits, advocated to Congress on behalf of wilderness preservation, and achieved recognition from many organizations and foundations. These include the National Wildlife Federation, the Lannan Foundation, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the Physicians for Social Responsibility, among many others. We may best know her as a nature writer, the author of Refuge, or Pieces of White Shell, or An Unspoken Hunger, or the recent Erosion essays of Undoing. But Terry Tempest Williams also pointedly addresses politics and political systems, America's faults and its injustices. In a 2003 commencement address at the University of Utah, Ms. Williams recounted how her life changed when, as a college student herself, she first encountered the writers of American Romanticism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson. Their words, she tells us, became sacred text, while she, quote, came to understand through her education in the humanities that knowledge is another form of democracy, the freedom of expression that leads to empathy. Like Thoreau did in his own time, Ms. Williams asks tough questions in ours, like this one. How do we engage in conversation at a time when the definition of what it means to be a patriot is being narrowly construed? And this one, how do we engage in responsive citizenship in times of terror? These questions come from one of my favorite among her books, The Slim but Fierce Open Space of Democracy, published by the Orion Society in 2004 on the occasion of a national election occurring during the War on Terror. In this book, Ms. Williams recalls that politics are inseparable from the land, even as our hearts are inseparable from our homes. She writes that, quote, democracy is best practiced through its construction, not its completion. A never-ending project where the windows and doors remain open, a reminder to never close ourselves off to the sensory impulses of eyes and ears alert toward justice. Democracy is not a monument, but a home in a constant state of renovation, she says. In the open space of democracy, she insists, there is room for dissent, there is room for differences, and the health of the environment is seen as the wealth of our communities. Also in this book, in a meditation on the Arctic Tern, Terry Tempest Williams suggests that perhaps this bird knows light like no other living being. The Arctic Tern's migratory path charts some 22,000 miles between the Arctic and Antarctica. No creature on Earth, she explains, has spent more time in daylight than this species. And then she writes, "What I know is this: when one hungers for light, it is only because one's knowledge of the dark is so deep." Terry Tempest Williams, your writings carry on the Thoreauvian tradition of nature writing in so many ways, helping us navigate the darkness and the deep. And you do so much more through your treatments of tragedy and terror, human disease, and environmental degradation. You've given us the gift of seeing our connections to one another across place and politics. You once wrote, "My refuge exists in my capacity to love." Thank you for sharing with your readers, with us, the darkness amid your astonishing light. And thank you for sharing your magnificent capacity for love, your refuge, now ours. Please join me in congratulating Terry Tempest Williams as she receives the Thoreau Prize.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Rochelle. That was the most beautiful introduction imaginable. It's hard to find words after that. And thank you for all you're doing for us in terms of your own scholarship and as president of the Thoreau Society and as a fellow Westerner. And thank you, Michael, for directing us, for your stamina, and all you give to the Thoreau Society. And John, thank you for your beautiful acknowledgement, land acknowledgement. And to you, Dale, we so appreciate you recognizing the power of nature writing, of environmental criticism, and Thoreau. It is humbling to stand before you, and especially in the midst of so many extraordinary Thoreauvian scholars and dear friends. I'm so mindful that I know so little, and I just want you to know that tonight I'm offering a kaleidoscope of thoughts and feelings. I'm so aware of what I don't know. This is not an apology. I never allow my students to do this, but it's the truth. And I also want to acknowledge my wonderful, beloved Brooke Williams. Thank you for all of your support. He should be here instead of me, because without you, Brooke, I would not find any words. October 28th, from Thoreau's journal, 160 plus years. Here is an Indian summer day, not so warm indeed as the 19th and 20th, but warm enough for pleasure. The majority of the white maples are bare, but others are still thickly leaved, the leaves being a greenish yellow. It appears then that they hold their leaves longer than other maples. How handsome the great red oak acorns now. I stand under the tree on Emerson's lot. They are still falling. I heard one fall into the water as I approached. They strew the ground and the bottom of the river thickly, and while I stand here, I hear one strike the bows with force as it comes down and drops into the water. He could be here right now with us on this beautiful summer-like day. I don't know on days like this if we should be thrilled or terrified. Probably both. I'm going to be sharing some thoughts for the next 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And what I want to say is to the members of the Thoreau Society, distinguished Thoreauvian scholars among you, and friends here and at home on Zoom, thank you. Thank you for this beautiful recognition. And please know that this award has profound meaning to me. Henry David Thoreau has been my literary and philosophical guide since 1971, when my father gave me a copy of Walden for Christmas. I was so enthralled by the book that I bought a special green pen to underline it. Most of the pages have turned green. It's become a journal, a scrapbook full of marginal notes, vocabulary learned, photographs taken, feathers, leaves, and soil smudges collected, all from Walden, and each time I return, I add a paragraph of what occurred. This particular passage is from May 1st, 2023, last spring, when I was here with my class of 15 students called Finding Beauty in a Broken World from the Harvard Divinity School. The passage that I wrote in my copy of Walden reads, "A circle with students at Thoreau's cabin site. A man kicks down the cairn. Bucket. Thoreau didn't get it, and neither did you. We tried to see the man. He runs past us. Some saw him, I did not. Would it matter what he looked like, what he was wearing? What mattered was what he yelled, and why. We were delivered a poem, a riddle. I carry that riddle with me now. To be in the distinguished company of dear friends and literary heroes, Lewis Hyde among them, with whom I have shared sacred times. I think of Gretel Ehrlich, E.O. Wilson, Barry Snyder, Peter Matheson, T.C. Boyle, Diane Ackerman, Linda Hogan, Mary Oliver, George Schaller, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Bernard Heinrich, Dane Goodall, and Cy Montgomery. I wish we could be sitting beneath the pines at the site of Thoreau's cabin, discussing what Thoreau didn't get, and neither do we. What are we not seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, feeling? What do we not know now? And what did Thoreau not know then? This man made a pilgrimage. He was disappointed. He was angry. He spoke to us. Thoreau doesn't get it, and neither do we. Can we hold this question together? I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to confront only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So these are my questions. Are we living deliberately? How are we living? Are we confronting only the essential facts of life? What are the essential facts of life when everything feels upside down? To see if we can't learn what it had to teach. What is it? The woods, the desert, the mountains, the oceans, our own home grounds. What are they teaching us? When we meet death, through illness, accidents, a shooter, or a war, or through our own aging bodies, will we discover in our hearts that we had not lived, but rather postponed, disregarded, or denied who we are and what we were meant to do? I've been thinking about these questions. What I can tell you is I'm living deliberately half my year away from home, away from my husband, my family, my father who is 90, and the desert I love. What are the essential facts of my life? I love and need my solitude as a writer, and I also feel working with young people and teaching is an essential part of who I am. Is this a split life or a balanced one? And as a privileged white American, am I consuming more than most on this planet? Yes. Quote, "Our life is frittered away by details," writes Henry in his chapter, Where I Lived and What I Lived For, in Walden. Am I frittering away my life through details and missing the essential facts of life? This week? Yes. To be awake is to be alive, Thoreau tells us, just a few paragraphs before I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. Alongside his other wisdoms in this chapter, I want to suck the marrow of life. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Simplify, simplify. For all of us who love Thoreau, these are among our aspirational mantras. No? So, what does my own home ground have to teach me? At this moment, what the bodies of water in the Great Basin and Colorado River are showing us is that we are running out of water. Great Salt Lake is disappearing, and in 7 years, she could be gone. The Colorado River is so low, by the end of last summer, just a few months ago, there are places you can wade across. Why? Because of our consumption. Think of the thirst demanded by Salt Lake City, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. When I face my death, or at the end of my life, will I have lived and loved fully, more than I have consumed and wasted? Suddenly, this quote that I have held close to my heart for over 5 decades feels much more uncomfortable. Perhaps it is not the coda for simply embracing wildness that I once thought it was. Fuck it. Thoreau didn't get it, and neither do you. These are difficult times, complicated times, times when uncertainty on all fronts is where we are being asked to take a stand. Confrontation is everywhere we go. So is hostilities, even at Thoreau's cabin site. He tells us, take up a little life into our pores. This is my new favorite quote of Thoreau. Take up a little life into our pores. Just saying that, I can breathe more deeply. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Those 2 sentences are on my desk. My time as a professor at the Harvard Divinity School right now is not about focusing on a particular subject and lecturing to a classroom of students. My time is spent with them sitting in a circle and listening to the truths of their lives, fluid, not fixed, be it issues surrounding race or gender or safety or the immoralities of war. They are protesting the role of America in the world. They are voicing their outrage, and they are crying from their grief as they commit collectively acts of nonviolence and civil disobedience in the name of Israel, Hamas war, in the name of genocide and ecocide, in the name of climate justice for all life, human and wild. They are recognizing, as members of their generation, the moral entanglement of all these issues in the heat of a burning world. Thoreau doesn't get it, and neither do you. I want to tell you a story of one of my dearest friends named Jonah Yellowman. He's the spiritual advisor for Bears Ears, now a national monument, in the Four Corners region where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona share a common point. I've known Jonah for over a decade, and he has become one of my closest friends. When the Divinity School was thinking about different kinds of spiritualities, I thought about Jonah And I invited him to come to the Divinity School to speak to our students. He agreed to come, and we flew together from Salt Lake City to Boston. He'd never been on a plane before, and he was glued to the window. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. And when we got there, I had asked Jonah, is there anywhere you want to go, or is there something in particular that you would love to do? And he didn't hesitate. He said, I would like to make prayers to the Atlantic Ocean. I am of the water clan. And so we got off the plane, we got our bags, we rented a car, and we went out to Revere Beach, which, as you know, is the first public beach in our country. It was a wild storm. I mean, winds and rain, and at the ocean in March, it was wickedly cold. It didn't deter or disrupt Jonah's intention. And there was no one on the beach, which you know what a rarity that is. And I just stayed back and watched him as he was literally blown to the edge of low tide. And there I could see him kneel in the water and exchange water from the Colorado River into the Atlantic in the name of reciprocity. I then watched Jonah twirl and twirl and twirl, taken by the wind, and he ran back. He then said, Terry, is there a body of water that matters to you here that you would like me to bless? And I said, Jonah, there is. Walden Pond. And he said, then let's go there. So in the rain pelting, and we could hardly see, and I'm not a good driver in Boston, I can assure you, we made it to Concord, we went to Walden, and we stood at the top of Walden before you go down the steps, and he said, stop, tell me why this water matters to you. And I said, well, Jonah, there was a man named Henry David Thoreau, and he lived here for 2 years. And Jonah said, 2 years. And I just became embarrassed, saying, but it was an important 2 years. You know, he did a lot in those 2 years. And he said, I would like to meet this man. And I just thought, what did Thoreau not get? What do you not get either? And as we walked down to the waters, Jonah took out his medicine pouch and performed a ceremony on the edge of those waters for Walden Pond and for Henry David Thoreau. There was no judgment. There was only grace and gratitude. I will never forget that. What does it mean to be of place? What does it mean to commit to a place? What does it mean to honor the places of others? Thoreau, as Laura Wells reminds us in her beautiful biography, that first and foremost, Henry was a communitarian, committed to Concord. I see these commitments to community all around me. I think about Morgan Curtis, a student activist who rode her bicycle to Paris in 2015 for COP21 in the spirit of Thoreau. And she and her colleagues of the United Nations Youth Group disrupted the meetings. They had in their pockets civil disobedience. They disrupted the meetings in the name of climate change. John Kerry met with them. After it was over, I met with Morgan, and she was really discouraged. She said it didn't matter, it didn't make a difference. And she put a tattoo. She got a tattoo for the emissions of that moment so she would never forget. She was politicized by the fossil fuel divestment student movement and spent 8 years as an organizer and youth activist, educator in climate and social justice movements. In her words, quote, in those spaces, I came to be passionate about grief work and direct action. This led her to think about her ancestors and the harm they had caused. which led her on the path of reparations for enslaved people, indigenous people, and how, as a woman of privilege, she is now, quote, on the journey of redistributing 100% of her inherited wealth and 50% of her earned income, working closely with both family members and friends from social justice movements to hold her to account. She wrote a letter to her descendants, an excerpt from which I would like to read to you. Quote, "The money that came down through our family, gathered by generations of bankers, lawyers, captains of ships and industry, has finally been returned to the people and lands from which it was taken. It is my prayer that you are still connected to the Black and Indigenous villages into which it flowed, that you are shaped by their leadership, and that you will still find ways to mutually support one another as the world heats and unravels. These villages are refugia of knowledge and wisdom, places where intergenerational trauma was able to be witnessed and healed, where children grew into elders that guided their people onwards. These are your inheritance, our family's legacy." At a time when there's so much despair, it's people like Morgan that reminds me there is another path. I've been so moved by Cy Montgomery and Matt Patterson. Perhaps you've seen their collaboration with Turtles, and that during the pandemic, they were working with a local rehabilitation center, fixing, mending, loving, healing turtles, mending the world, she says, shell by shattered shell. Mary O'Brien's our neighbor, a scientist working in Utah with an organization she and members of her community have called 1100, which is the number of native bees in Utah, suffering from being on the path of extinction. She's not only identifying them, but changing Forest Service policy that allows honeybee apiaries in our national forests that are endangering native bees, competing for nectar. Therefore, she's advocating that honeybees not be allowed where native bees are. She's educating all of us. She just retired from the Grand Canyon Trust, and during the pandemic, Brooke and I had a party for her, 4 of us, she and her husband, and a friend of mine who's a jeweler made a beautiful bee made of crystals that I thought would be so beautiful for Mary. When she opened it, she looked at it, she goes, "I can't believe you're giving me a honeybee." It's Nan Seymour holding vigil on Great Salt Lake during each legislative session from January through March. Not an easy time to be on the shores of Great Salt Lake. She's inspiring the community to become, in her words, lake-facing people who care about restoring the inland sea, drop by creative drop, as we move to add water to our mother lake. I think of the women of Bears Ears who are calling for the rematriation of Mother Earth as they work toward healing their communities, educating their communities through traditional knowledge and practices for their health, for the well-being of their people, through the generations. I think of the change makers, the disruptors and innovators in our own communities and how they are listening to their own drum beats, as Thoreau has called for a sovereignty of soul. Again, that quote we all know, "If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away." Drum beats, heartbeats, repetition is spiritual. I went to the woods. Sometimes I think that in this time of disruption, in this time of uncertainty, when everything seems upside down, inside out, and sideways, that we are in fact eroding and evolving at once. And that's a good thing. We are broken-hearted people, learning to live and love with a broken heart in broken times, trying to act with grace, grace as defined as something unearned, but given. We question ourselves. We enter into the vitality of the struggle, supporting marginalized communities and participating in intergenerational work. We give back to our communities in the name of reciprocity. Evolution favors experimentation. We create and act with the gifts that are ours. Last weekend, Brooke and my niece and I came to Walden on that glorious rainy day. The last time Sarah, now 38 years old, was here was with her father, my brother Steve, who passed away from lymphoma. This was his last trip. It was the one place he wanted to go to pay his respects to Thoreau and to Emerson. It was very moving for her. We went to the visitor's center to get a little dry, and I was so thrilled to see Jackie Cluft again. Each time I come, she is there and has been interpreting Walden Pond for the past 12 years. We talked. She's a biologist. Many of you know her. And when I asked how she was doing, she pointed to the whiteboard of wildlife seen during the week of October 14th through the 20th. I thought that was the best response I've ever seen for how are you. She pointed, and we read out loud, fish, largemouth and smallmouth bass, bluegill, koi, rainbow trout, brown trout, American eel, mammals, chipmunk, eastern cottontail, coyote, white-tailed deer, skunk, gray squirrel, red squirrel, reptiles, amphibians, American toad, garter snake, water snake, painted turtle, snapping turtle, red-eared slider, eastern spiny softshell, insects, bumblebee, cricket, cherry meadowhawk, monarch, cnidarians, freshwater jellyfish, birds, northern cardinal, black-capped chickadee, double-crested cormorant, brown creeper, mourning dove, wood duck, bald eagle, peregrine falcon, Canada goose, Cooper's hawk, red-tailed hawk, black-crowned night heron, great blue heron, blue jay, belted kingfisher, golden-crowned kinglet, common loon, say their names, remember their names, mallard, white-breasted nuthatch, great horned owl, eastern screech owl, barred owl, saw-whet owl, turkey vulture, eastern wood pewee, eastern phoebe, American robin, chipping sparrow, orange-crowned sparrow, swamp sparrow, white-breasted sparrow, European starling, tufted titmouse, hermit thrush, yellow-rumped warbler, downy woodpecker, hairy woodpecker, pileated woodpecker, red-bellied woodpecker, Carolina wren. Just reading those names, seeing those names, hearing those names brings joy. Bless the naturalists among us. No doubt, Thoreau knew these species also. I think of Thoreau's journal entry from the same week in 1860 as tension was in the air regarding slavery and the stirrings of the Civil War. October 17th. October 17th, Walden Woods, the trees which with us grow in masses, not merely scattering, are white pines, oaks, white birch, red maple, chestnut, hickory, alder, hemlock, spruce, and larch, cedar, white and red, willow, locust, apple, red, cherry, sugar maple. And he goes on, and then talks about chestnut and hickories have become rare. It's an interesting inquiry, he writes, what determines which species of these shall grow on a given tract. It is evident that the soul determines this to some extent. And then he talks about the sadness of these large trees, some of them 4 feet in diameter, dying. And then the litany of berries. Berries now ripe, blueberries, bunchberries, fetid currant, red cherry, black chokeberry, cranberry, red elder, quite showy, Clintonia borealis, raspberries, berries not yet red but green. And then the birds, again the same litany that you just heard. Jackie is carrying on this tradition of recording a phenology of place. I learned how this intrepid interpreter of Walden Pond State Reservation has made her own contributions to identifying wildlife in the region and is contributing to citizen science with a fuller portrait of biodiversity. Quote, in an article, a mysterious fly was noticed on the south shore of Martha's Vineyard not long ago. Originally misidentified as a member of a different family, Canassidae, the fly was posted on Facebook with a request for help with ID. It caught the eye of Jackie Cluft, identified as an interpreter with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and recreation who earned a PhD studying beach invertebrates. Based on her fieldwork experience, Mrs. Cleft proposed Hecamede albicans, which is a shorefly. It is now awaiting confirmation. These are Thoreau's descendants. Jackie and I started talking about the truths of our lives, and she asked how my students were, and I told her about the last time we were here on May Day last spring, how the man had yelled, "Fuck it." Thoreau didn't get it, and neither do you, after kicking down the cairn. I told her how we first laughed, out of shock, which quickly turned to fear, then curiosity. Why? What did he mean? What was the source of his discontent, his disappointment, after making this commitment to come to Thoreau's cabin site? As is so often the case with divinity school students, their curiosity turned to compassion. What happened to him? And then back to the questions. What do you think Thoreau didn't get, or that we don't understand? I asked Jackie. I heard her silence. I heard her say peace. I heard her say, I love my job. I heard her say Walden holds the legacy of the conservation movement. I heard her say people come from all over the world to pay homage to Thoreau, to live more simply, to live closer to nature, to care about democracy and justice. There are more visitors, she said, to Walden than there were in the town during Thoreau's time, and now. I heard her say, I love talking to the people who come here and share the wonders of the natural world. It's always changing. And then she said, but don't ask me, let's ask China Lemire. She knows as much, maybe more about Thoreau than almost anyone here. We met, we hugged, realizing we'd actually met in 2017 at the annual Thoreau meeting, and another conversation ensued, a conversation that changed me. We spoke about grief, about how a raven stood on Thoreau's shoulder after his brother John died. He talks about in the dream world one doesn't know if that's real or imagined. I too have a raven standing on my shoulder. His grief is evident in his journals about John Brown, about slavery, about the coming of a civil war, about the trees that were dying and the birds disappearing. Thoreau would understand where we are now. His grief is registered throughout his journals, as you well know. Another question then is, how do we hold this? The sorrow, the grief, the beauty, the joy. Thoreau gives us clues in his essay Shipwreck, the first chapter in his book of Cape Cod. How do we hold all of this grief? Remember, he says, everyone has one body that they can hold. Something like that. Remember? He said, I cannot grasp all who died in this shipwreck, but I do know one body. I can grieve for one body. China paused. She said, I have to tell you I love Thoreau, but I may be breaking up with him. Why do we put people on pedestals, she said. Why do we come here to worship Henry as an icon? It's not very Thoreauvian. What do we worship? The man, the place, the wisdom, or the experience? What would happen, she asked, if we take Henry out of Walden and see the pond for itself through the lens of our own perceptions? Because if Thoreau has done his job, I got thinking, of how to perceive the world, how to really see and feel the world that surrounds us, then might not Henry disappear so that Walden Pond can appear more fully? And then she sent me to Robert Thorson's book, The Guide to Walden Pond, an exploration of its history, nature, landscape, and literature of one of America's most iconic places, or Black Walden by Elise Lemire. or paying attention to the two benches that invite us to learn about Black history. And then she paused. I honestly believe if Thoreau had lived longer, his focus would have been on Indigenous people. His heart was already there. How deep is Walden Pond? As deep as we are. We were three women from three different generations talking about Thoreau, Walden, and nature. 33, 52, 68 years of age. Thoreau had changed each of our lives and continues to move us forward in our own understanding of living deliberately. We are eroding and evolving at once. Perhaps we will never be able to see beyond ourselves because of our own self-consciousness and solipsism. As Larry Buell states, Thoreau seemed to have had in mind a cross between Socrates' praise of the examined life and Buddhist mindfulness, not that he was consciously thinking of either. But we can try. We can try and listen to the wider, wilder world. A few days later, I received a letter from China, and with her permission, I would like to read an excerpt. Again, she is a descendant of Henry. Terry, when we first met back in 2017, my passion for Concord and Thoreau's world was leading every step I took. When Thoreau asks how one measures their success, I knew success as not dreading to get out of bed to go to work in the morning, even though I had to struggle to rise free from care before the dawn, quote unquote. What I seek now and deem as success is, simply put, a qualified life and a confident one. I think a lot of us, she writes, Walden folk, have found a deep sense of companionship as we've walked with Thoreau through his detailed travels. He did try to capture every step he took with the perspective, quote, what business have I in the woods if I am thinking of something out of the woods, unquote. When Thoreau goes to Maine or when he walks the sand on Cape Cod Bay, most often it was with a companion, and that companion was always unnamed. Scholars now know of Joe Polis, of H.G.O. Blake, and the countless hours he spent close to Thoreau's soul. Channing too, but this unnamed companion allows us to feel invited to saunter alongside. I'm so grateful Thoreau took the time to document most of his walks, because at this point I've seen so much of New England by way of Thoreau's footsteps. He showed me so much, but like the hero's journey, come to die, discover that I too have lived. I've met thousands of folks who've made the pilgrimage to these sacred glacial-formed grounds. I fear I'll take Walden for granted someday, and that in a lot of ways I already am. I think there's a bit of energy that stays here when folks come to Walden for pilgrimage. The hundreds of thousands who have walked to the main beach and smiled simply, wept with joy, grieved, loved, played, quietly rested on these shores, and then went home feeling healed or inspired. Most of them, too, held a rock in their hand as they walked, charged it up with warm working hands, and placed it with a million more soul-charged fragments of earth. These days, she writes, and there's 2 more paragraphs I want to share. One of my most cherished walks at Walden has been time spent off Old County Road and the paths that surround what was once a busy carriage road. Who were those busy travelers? And the hours I've spent at Walden's breezes, a jungle of bittersweet and other non-native shrubs, a leach field, and paved slabs where trailers used to sit and house up to 70 trailer park residents who lived simply and rarely went over to the tourist destination. I cannot express the gratification I get working here, but I'm certainly not here for the money. I tell folks I work for Mass DCR to work at Walden Pond, not the other way around. The state benefits are encouraging, but the system is too frustrating to want to play that game. I've watched spring, and am now watching fall bird migration at Walden. These are precious, fleeting moments. With cosmic blessings, China, Lemire. These letters matter. These perceptions of the women who work here matter. The younger generation who is taking up the cause of Thoreau through civil disobedience and courage matter. Maybe the walk to Thoreau's cabin site is going to give us answers, China says to Jackie and me. Before they went back to work, and I joined my family walking around Walden Pond. But maybe it won't. We just don't know. Maybe we will never know. But we can pay attention. Simone Weil says, attention is a prayer, which is exactly what Henry David Thoreau did every day of his life. We have 2 million words that he left us in his journal over 24 years. My father turned 90 this year, and instead of receiving gifts, he said, I want to give gifts. And he asked me what I would like, and I didn't hesitate. I said, Dad, I would love the collected journals of Henry. And he goes, I know, Thoreau. And every day I've been reading excerpts, and I've come to love him all the more for who he was as a human being. Feisty, fiery, funny, devoted, spiritual, mystical, wild, dogged, humorous, serious, awake, alive, and alert. 5 more minutes. I'm going to make some leaps of thought, so bear with me. My mind returns to Lewis Hyde's 2 landmark books, The Gift, How the Gift Must Always Move, and A Primer for Forgetting, How Memory and Forgetting are part of the same equation. Hyde writes, quote, every act of memory is an act of forgetting. He talks about how the bardic song was meant to induce those twin states. Quote, for though a man hath sorrow and grief, yet when a singer, the servant of the muses, chants the glorious deeds of old, he forgets his heaviness and remembers not his sorrows at all. When I read that, I thought about Thoreau and his Aeolian harp, the well-known story of how in 1851 Henry entered a ravine cut for railroad tracks, and there he heard a vibrating telegraph wire, like an Aeolian harp. As Gray Matthews wrote, Thoreau sat down and listened as the musical strain suddenly reminded him of, quote, of what finer and deeper stirrings I was susceptible, and that, quote, there were higher, infinitely higher planes of life which behooved me never to forget, unquote. He explained that he'd been listening to the wind, which, quote, was conveying a message to me from heaven, unquote, when it began to speak through the vibrating wire as it passed. And, quote, I instantly sat down on a stone at the foot of the telegraph pole and attended to the communication, which said, bear in mind, child, and never for an instant forget that there are higher planes, infinitely higher planes of life than this thou art now traveling on. Know that the goal is distant and is upward and is worthy all your life's effort to attain to. And then it ceased. The writer Rick Bass from Montana asked the question 2 weeks ago at Climate Aid, a gathering in Portland, Maine, can one tree save a forest? Can one song? He was referring, and this was about ancient forests, a curtain of green stretching from Maine to Florida, up to Montana, to the southwest, to California, to the northwest, including Black Ram Forest in the Yak that we are hoping will become the world's first climate refuge. Rick was referring to a 350-year-old Engelmann spruce that had fallen as a result of a snowstorm last year. He had a friend who makes guitars, called him, and they reverentially cut a part of the trunk to make a special musical instrument on behalf of the forests. He handed the musician, Maggie Rogers, this guitar made of spruce, 350 years old. Maggie, who maybe some of you know, is a wonderful young musician, electric. Her voice sounds like an angel. And she sang something a cappella that moved all of us to tears. And then she picked up this guitar made of spruce. And all I can tell you is her voice skipped. It was as though she was wrestling with God. And as she was singing and struggling, she was, all we can do is loosen the strings and listen to its own voice. And she played it raw, discordant, of this moment. And it was real. What does Thoreau not get, and neither do we? That question. Writers, musicians, and artists remind us to go deeper. Lewis Hyde moves to his imaginary museum of forgetting and cites Robert Smithson, creator of the spiral jetty and also the Amarillo ramp, the piece he was working on when he died in a plane crash 17 miles from this site. Smithson writes, "When I get to a site that strikes a timeless chord, I use it. The site selection is by chance. There is no willful choice. A site at 0 degree where the material strikes the mind, where absences become apparent, appeals to me, where the disintegrating of space and time seems apparent, sort of an end of selfhood, where the ego vanishes for a time." Unquote. Perhaps Walden Pond was what Thoreau found, by no willful choice, but by his desire to both remember and forget, where the ego vanishes for a time, where we are connected to earth. It is here, by his birth, by his birthright, he became present, attentive to the world, both human and wild, interconnected, interrelated, an interdependent, enchanted entanglement. This, too, paying attention, in today's world, is an act of civil disobedience. Why we make our pilgrimages to Walden Pond, and why we can forget Thoreau and remember the source, and in so doing receive the gift that must always move, to confront the essentials of life. The koan comes back to me. Thoreau doesn't get it, and neither do we. It's something to ponder. The truth is, we may never understand this project of living deliberately, but our attempt to live deliberately is a worthy enterprise. And lastly, when we were at Walden last week, I bought the book, Thoreau in an Age of Crisis, edited by Kristen Case, Rochelle L. Johnson, and Henrik Otterberg. And something beautiful happened. It started with the story of my niece, Sarah Tiwanat Tempest Kimball, what she told Brooke and me. She said she had this dream, a disturbing dream, a numinous dream, about a kingfisher, orange blue. It was about grief and loss, and she shared the details, personal, private, and prescient. Throughout her time with us in Cambridge, everywhere we were met by kingfishers. At the Museum of Natural History, in our home, where there was a small wooden carved kingfisher, a gift from a friend, we kept discussing her dream and what it might have meant, delving into various dictionaries of symbols and poems. Once home, I sat down, we lit candles, and I opened Thoreau in Times of Crisis. And to my astonishment, the first essay was titled, Grieving with the Kingfisher, Thoreau's Mourning Work in an Age of Political and Environmental Violence, by Rochelle Johnson. Rochelle challenges Emerson's 1862 contention that, quote, the meaning of nature was never attempted to be defined by Thoreau. Johnson points to Thoreau's receptivity as itself part of an attempt to make meaning through the apprehension of a single bird, the kingfisher. This, then, in Rochelle's words, is one use we might make of Thoreau. Through him, we uncover the possibility of starting with a single thing, a bird, and weaving a fabric of meaning in the universe. She goes on to say, quote, while that meaning is not reducible to a single word, axiom, or principle, it nonetheless, grief is love. Sarah and Brooke and I read the essay out loud, and we marveled at the synchronicity, where the outer and inner world meet through story. Sarah's questions were not answered as much as explored. She has taken the kingfisher as her mentor in this beautiful broken world, both an alarm in Thoreau's words, and as a bird of light who calls forth halcyon days. Grief is love. Grief and love are siblings. It certainly was the case with Henry and his brother John. Grief dares us to love once more, and a grief shared is a grief endured. We are all broken-hearted people trying to make meaning in a world on fire. We do know, and we do get, one bird, one pond, one lake. I can speak to you from my own broken heart, Great Salt Lake. And I want to just close. Chip, can I borrow that book I just gave you? And it's just a paragraph, but I want to. Thank you. This is the great Chip Blake from Orion Magazine, who's been my editor for years and now is again. I just want to close with 2 paragraphs about grief and love. I am searching for grace. If the facts don't matter anymore and misinformation does, if we fail to listen to the indigenous wisdom of First Nations and remain unmoved toward another way of being, in right relationship to Earth, and the stories and statistics that scientists are bringing to us do not stir us to action on behalf of a living world that is suffering, and if the lives of our children and the future of their children's children are not first in our minds and thwarting the easy sleep of our privilege, then the question must be asked, are we too dead to the world to feel alive? Believe the long-legged birds who are circling above us, desperately looking for water. Believe the forests that are burning, whose surviving trees will later stand as sentinels, charred witnesses to animal bodies reduced to ash. Believe in flash floods roaring through burnt canyons, gathering debris in rivers running black in the desert, even in times of drought. Believe Great Salt Lake is retreating in plain sight, leaving what's left to the dust devils, whipping up clouds and chemicals, resting on the dry lake bed as we inhale the toxic world we have created. Believe in the once shimmering ecological crisis or a political crisis. It is a spiritual one. The earth will survive us. We are the ones being baptized by fire. Thank you.